So
we can start.
Good evening and welcome to this fascinating talk which we have on the VOC and the Dutch in India. It is very difficult to get someone to speak on a topic like this because I was very apprehensive about this topic. I had no idea about the role of the Dutch in India, and I'm really happy to have Dr. Rashna Poncha speak on this topic. We have had the privilege of having Dr. Poncha with us as a member of the managing committee of the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute, and she has participated in a number of our programs, both in presenting papers and research. Dr. Poncha has completed her doctorate on the study of Frere Town, Bombay, and this has opened up a very wide area of expertise for her. She has worked on various aspects of this topic later on, and she has later on been co-editor of the book on Maharashtra and its Maharashtra socio-cultural perspectives, contributions of ethnic groups and communities. And as such, presently, Dr. Poncha is working with her students to prepare an exhibition for the CSVSMS Museum and working specifically on women at the turn of the century in India. So let me request Dr. Poncha now to take over and speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Modi, and thank you very much, the K.R. Kama Oriental, for inviting me for this talk. I'm going to be speaking today as well as moderating, so may I please ask that everyone keep their mics on mute, and if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. Otherwise, at the end of the paper presentation, I will open the floor for questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So I'll just share screen. So today I'm going to be discussing the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, and the Dutch presence here in India. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of background as to what the VOC was, how did they come here to India, and what remains of their presence here in India today. So the arrival of the Europeans, not just the Dutch, to the shores of India can be linked to a time known as the Age of Discovery in Europe. A combination of circumstances led to men seeking new routes across the sea from the mid-15th to the mid-16th centuries. They were not looking for new lands, but the hunt for new routes led to the discovery of many new lands. The reason for this hunt for new routes can be attributed to various reasons. So with the breakup of the Mongol Empire towards the end of the 14th century, safe passage on the overland route, what we often call the Silk Route, was no longer guaranteed for Western merchants. Secondly, the Ottoman Turks and the Venetians controlled commercial access to the Mediterranean, as well as the old sea routes from the east. So countries along the Atlantic coast of Europe were losing out on the trade, as well as paying exorbitant amounts to buy these goods. So these countries now began to look for other routes to ensure a part of the world trade for themselves. A route to the east was discovered by the Portuguese, and it was the race for spices that led the Portuguese to invest time and money in finding their way to India. Pepper was king and everybody wanted a piece of the trade, but the Portuguese managed to hold on to it till the end of the 16th century. In the latter half of the 16th century, England, Holland, and France, all growing commercial and naval powers, waged a fierce struggle against the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly of world trade. In 1580, the Portuguese royal family died out in the direct line, and Philip II of Spain took over the Portuguese throne. This upheaval led to the fall in the supply of pepper to Lisbon, and other European countries began to move in. English privateers and Dutch traders quickly began to raise funds for expeditions to India and further east. The Dutch were also able to use the navigational knowledge of the geographer Planicus and of Dutch seafarers who had traveled to the east in the service of the Portuguese. However, they did try to find better routes to get to the Indies, something that would be shorter and would entail fewer enemy ships en route. Believing that there were northern passages that would get them through to the Indies faster, 3 expeditions were funded by the state. The northern passages would have tried to go across this area. Unfortunately, the Americas stood in the middle, a fact that they did not realize at that time. So the first 2 came back after a futile search for the passage. So finally, they decided that they would not spend any more money at state expense, and further expeditions were abandoned. The Dutch state promised significant rewards to anyone who managed to find the northern route, but it was not to be. So the first successful trip, if one could call it that, took place in 1595 when the first Dutch fleet from the Company of Fair in Amsterdam set off from Texel, a small island right here, this small island. I'm going to make this into a laser pointer here. That's Texel. 3 large, well-stocked, well-equipped ships, accompanied by a smaller, heavily armed pinnace, followed the route taken from a description by Jan Huycken van Linschoten, who had made the journey earlier on a Portuguese ship. They had a very tough journey with many conflicts along the way, and many lives were lost. They finally reached Bantam, which was the main pepper port in Java, in 1596. Bantam was the most important port on the island of Java for the spice trade. It's right here where my pointer is. And it continued to be an important port for very long until its harbor silted up. Today it lies in ruins near the city of Banten in Java. So from that first voyage, 3 out of the 4 ships managed to return in 1597 with just 87 survivors out of the original crew of 240. This voyage, though it was a commercial failure, had nonetheless proved it possible to sail to Asia. This became the first of many voyages to the east. The goal was not India, but rather the Moluccas. So if I may just show you on this map, this is where the Moluccas are. Small individual merchant companies put together fleets of 4 to 5 ships, and they would sail out of Amsterdam and Rotterdam for the Indies. But the competition between all these companies was not helping anybody. The competition pushed the prices down, and the expeditions became prohibitively expensive. The traders also had to be protected from the Portuguese, and this protection came at a price from the Dutch state. More profits down the drain. So the Dutch merchants finally came together, and after rather difficult negotiations among the various companies, decided to set up a single joint company, the Dutch East India Company, also called the United East India Company or the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. The VOC, as we call it, was founded on the 20th of March, 1602. They were given the monopoly for all Dutch trade and shipping in Asia. Building up a trade network far overseas in a time of war with Spain and Portugal required a lot of funds. An investment of close to 6.5 million Dutch guilders was set up as share capital by shareholders who would receive a dividend from the profits of the return shipments. Anybody could invest. The shareholders came from varied walks of life. You had daily wage workers, you had preachers, doctors, big merchants. The amounts invested also varied from 50 guilders to 85,000 guilders. The VOC was granted a patent by the Dutch States General. Apart from granting them the monopoly in trade, it also granted them the right to build forts, wage war, and conclude treaties in the name of the States General. In addition to the trading, the company also had to help in the war against Spain and Portugal by bringing in more money. The war fleet would in turn help defend trading positions in the east. The English competition was allowed to sail close to the Moluccas in the hope of harassing the Portuguese. The VOC itself was a large organization. It was divided into several chambers: Amsterdam, Zeeland, Delft, Rotterdam, Home, and Inkhausen. Each of the chambers had their own directors, shipyards, and warehouses. They all had their own personnel and equipped their own ships. So this is an image, a drawing of the shipyard of the United East India Company, or the VOC, in Amsterdam, rigging out their ships. The directors of the old companies became directors in the new company. Altogether, there were 60 directors. These were now no longer jointly or individually liable for the debts of the company. The governance of the company in the Indies was highly centralized. The highest authority rested with the Governor General and the Council of the Indies, also called the High Indies Government, which had its seat at Batavia. Batavia corresponds with modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia, and this is a map of Batavia with its fort and walls along the seashore. And this is a lovely painting of the fort at Batavia. The members of the Council of the Indies also came from the administrative setups in the outer regions. The Governor General and the Council were naturally supposed to be subordinate to the government in the Netherlands, but being so far from the Netherlands, they tended to act independently, waging wars and signing treaties with local rulers. The VOC had dozens of trading posts or factories within a huge trade network that stretched across Asia and Africa. All these factories, or lodges, as they were known by the Dutch and the French, came under the authority of the high government. Most of the settlements were small offices and trading settlements and did not even own their own land. Between a few dozen and several hundreds of VOC servants worked in these establishments. The VOC did acquire its own land for the important settlements on Java, in the Moluccas, and in Ceylon. Batavia was the main settlement of the VOC, its central point in the trade network in Asia. More than 20,000 people worked for the VOC in Asia alone in the mid-18th century. More than half the company officers were soldiers. The men on the ships made up a further 25%, while the merchants and the administrative cadre made up the rest. This concentration around Southeast Asia required control of the eastern seas, and for this, the Dutch had to eliminate their main European rivals, the Portuguese. They defeated them and ousted them from Southeast Asia. But the Portuguese managed to hang on to Goa and other small settlements in India. The next big obstacle for the Dutch were the English, who had followed them to the East Indies. However, the East India Company was no match for the Dutch at this time and was sent packing from the East Indies in 1623. The Dutch objective was not religion or empire, but trade, in particular the spice trade. They wanted a monopoly in the spice trade, and it was this that led later to imperialism. It was for this reason that they went directly to the East Indies, which were the main source of spices. India was of secondary importance for its pepper, cardamom, and textiles. The Dutch, like the British, were short of exchange goods. Silver was needed to buy the spices, and in order to avoid dipping into the scarce European resources, they needed to use some other commodity to exchange for the spices. Textiles, the silks and cottons from India, could be used to buy the spices, but silver was required for that also. So, in order to retain the spice monopoly, the Dutch developed an elaborate trade system that spread from the Persian Gulf to Japan, and its only objective was to get goods that they could use to exchange for spices without having to use any of their European resources. It was this trade that brought the Dutch to the Coromandel coast, Surat, and to Bengal. Dutch sea power, which was more efficient than the Portuguese, secured them a monopoly on the islands and the sea lanes. But the story was very different in land areas where they would start facing stiff competition, particularly from the British. Dutch presence in India lasted for over 200 years, between 1605 and 1625. The Dutch East India Company first established themselves on the Coromandel coast. By 1627, they had established themselves in Surat and Bengal, and then they took the Portuguese forts on the Malabar after they took Ceylon from the Portuguese. Their establishments in India were divided under two governorates, that is Dutch Ceylon and Dutch Coromandel, a commandment, Dutch Malabar, and two directorates, Dutch Bengal and Dutch Surat. Surat, being an important international trading port for the Mughal Empire, was the first Indian city to be visited by Dutch merchants as early as 1602. However, the two unfortunate merchants had hardly left the city to travel north when the Portuguese intercepted them and executed them. In 1607, another Dutch merchant who made it to Surat was harassed to such an extent that it is believed he committed suicide. So not exactly a very auspicious beginning. The Dutch settled on the Coromandel coast in 1605 and set up a small establishment at Masulipatam. Their lodge at Masulipatam continued operating till 1756, when the Dutch left Masulipatam for good. It's a beautiful view of Masulipatam. You can see the small fortress and the town of Masulipatam. In the meantime, that poor fort went through at least 3 major fires, a cyclone, and a tsunami. They also set up a small establishment in the village of Petapulis, which is today's Nizamapatnam. In 1606, this village was very, very famous for its very fine linen textiles, but the factory was not very successful and was abandoned by 1668. The Dutch were determined to have a strong presence on the Coromandel and traded here for cotton textiles, including fabric for shrouds. They traded in rice, salt, saltpeter, which is an active ingredient for gunpowder, and indigo. The Dutch began to build a fort at Devanampatnam after permission was granted by the Nayakas of Jinji. Construction started in 1608. But the Nayakas took it from the Dutch under pressure from the Portuguese. The area was buzzing with trade as sandalwood, camphor, cloves, nutmeg, mace, velvets, porcelains, copper and brass all sailed out on ships from this port. When the area was taken by the Marathas, Shivaji's son Rajaram auctioned the fort to the highest European bidder in 1690. The British won by outbidding the Dutch and the French. The governor of Madras acquired it and renamed it Fort St. David. Robert Clive became governor of Fort St. David in 1756. The Dutch still had their small lodge and warehouse at Cuddalore, but they were now required to pay taxes on their merchandise to the English. They finally decided to abandon the factory and the lodge, which had actually only served to keep an eye on the English. They now moved their factory to Porto Novo, what is today Paranjipettai, and built a new warehouse and an indigo dyeing factory there. However, the presence of the English close by in Fort St. David led to the decision to leave this lodge also. 2 Dutchmen were left behind there in order to continue to purchase cotton textiles, which were required in return for trading for spices in the Moluccas. From 1610 to 1687, Pulicat became the chief settlement of the Dutch on the Coromandel and the seat of the governor of the Coromandel coast. Pulicat was a very important settlement as there was a high demand in the Moluccas for the cotton fabrics produced here. The cotton fabrics would then be traded for the spices there. In 1613, the Dutch were given permission by the local rulers to build a fort. It was to have been jointly built and owned in conjunction with the local queen, but that does not seem to have happened, and the Dutch finished the famous Fort Geldria alone. This is the really beautiful Fort Geldria. It was built on the shores of the Pulicat Lake, ostensibly on the foundations of a Portuguese fort. And the fort became a focal point in local skirmishes, often protecting people by giving them shelter, people from nearby Portuguese colonies. In 1615, the first VOC mint was established in Fort Geldria, where initially Kas copper coins with the VOC monogram and a Sanskrit legend were minted. The Pulicat mint operated till 1674, when a new mint was established at Nagapattinam. These coins were used widely in Ceylon. Pulicat remained a very important trading post until the second half of the 17th century, when it began to decline due to the growing competition from the British. By 1689, the Dutch government moved to Nagapattinam and then to Ceylon. The fort was left with a handful of men and guns. It was surrendered to the British in 1795 and then blown up by the Dutch. This is another drawing of the beautiful fort. This is actually going to be a kind of repeating story. The Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the British are going to constantly fight for land, territory, and particularly for the forts. In 1612, the Dutch had set up a small branch establishment in Sadras, Sadrangapattinam. This is the old Sadras fort. It is rather well preserved. I'll show you pictures of it later on. It became a very important trading post, as the quality of cotton textiles here was very fine and they were beautifully painted. They also got stone for construction, which was then sent to Batavia and to Ceylon to construct houses. By 1749, the Dutch built a large fortified compound here. Like many of the other settlements, factories, and forts, Sadras also passed into the hands of the French, then was taken by the English, and then returned to the Dutch. The fortress was raided once again by the English in 1818 and came under the East India Company. There is a beautiful cemetery that is still there in the fort that has graves dating back to 1620, and its citadel has been restored by the ASI. Palikol, today's Palakolu, had a small lodge set up in 1613. The VOC set up an indigo dyeing factory for cotton fabrics, a bleaching factory, as well as a ropeway where you manufacture ropes for the ships, a forge, a carpentry yard, and a warehouse over here. However, this too had the same fate. It was taken by the English in 1781, who blew up many of the buildings. But they handed it back to the Dutch after the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War of 1780 to 84, only to take it back permanently by 1825. Golconda, today's Hyderabad, was a very important trading post for the Dutch. They maintained a permanent native VOC staff there from 1634. They bought cotton blankets, chintz, carpets, leather, iron, and diamonds in return for spices, ivory, coffee, and tea. However, their participation in this trade ended by 1693, when they were officially prohibited from trading there. Bimlipattanam, today's Bhimunipatnam, was the site of a Dutch lodge from 1652. The lodge was converted into a small fortress in 1758. It was not really an important center for trade. However, the area grew a lot of rice, which the Dutch required for supplying to Ceylon. So this is a map showing the new fort that would come up at Bhimunipatnam. And this is all that is left of it. You can just about see the outline of the fort in a satellite image. In 1658, the Dutch captured the town and fortress of Nagapattinam from the Portuguese, but they subsequently lost it to the local Nayaka ruler. However, it was taken back by the Dutch and came under the VOC governorate of Ceylon. Legend has it that a huge tidal wave destroyed the walls and most of the town. The Dutch used the rubble to build the new fort, Vijf Zinnen. This was a beautiful star fort, which became the seat of the governor when they moved their headquarters to Nagapattinam from Pulicat in 1690. And the 5 bastions were named after the 5 senses. That's what the name of the fort is. So hearing, sight, taste, smell, and sense. Pondicherry, a small trading post of the French, was actually bought from the Mughal emperor by the Dutch at the cost of 50,000 pagodas in 1688. The pagoda was a unit of currency. It was a coin made of gold or half gold, which was minted by local Indian dynasties as well as by the Dutch and the French and the British. The Dutch minted these pagodas of theirs at Tuticorin and at Colombo in Ceylon. In 1693, the VOC governor of the Coromandel finally took Pondicherry from the French. Their personnel were all sent back to France. The Dutch built a ring wall around the city, this is the wall, and also 7 strongholds to hold out the French. The high government in Batavia thought this was all a complete waste of money, and it does turn out to have been quite correct, because the war between France and the Netherlands in Europe ended in 1697, and Pondicherry had to be returned to the French as per the peace treaty, though the French did agree to pay the Dutch 16,000 pagodas for the fortifications that they had constructed. A large Dutch warehouse to store the textiles from the North Coromandel before they were sent off to the East Indies was set up at Jagannathpuram, today Kakinada in Andhra, in 1734. It became one of the most important VOC settlements on the Coromandel coast. It was surrendered to the English several times, only to be returned to the Dutch because of events in Europe. By 1881, it was finally handed over to the British. The first VOC ships arrived in Bengal in 1615, but their first permanent settlement only came up in Pipli, what is today's Baliapal, in 1627, because there was tremendous political unrest in the area. The Dutch were very interested in trading for cotton and silk textiles, opium, and saltpeter from Bengal, and they tried very hard to get a monopoly in the trade in saltpeter. The VOC ships made a biannual journey to Bengal. They would leave Bengal at the beginning of the northern monsoon around the middle of September, sail to Gale in Ceylon, where they would take on cinnamon and then sail on to Batavia, and then they would come back a second time in April. But the large VOC ships had a problem with the fast-flowing waters of the Ganga and its tributaries. Apparently, they lost 12 ships in the river and at the mouth of the river. And so in order to navigate the river safely, smaller ships began to be sent to Bengal. The VOC decided to make a settlement at Pipli because saltpeter was purified here. However, by the middle of the 17th century, Patna and Shiopra, what is later on Chapra, became the main centers for saltpeter. The settlement at Pipli also turned out to be not so favorable because of frequent flooding and the many sandbanks. They tried to run it as a transshipment port, but by 1670, the port was so badly silted that it had to be abandoned, and Hooghly became the chief settlement of the Dutch. Hooghly had been a Portuguese settlement until 1632. The Dutch set up a trading post here and gave it the name Hooghly after the Hooghly River in the Gangetic Delta. To begin with, Hooghly came under the jurisdiction of the Dutch Coromandel, but as the trading post became more and more important, it was given its own management. In 1656, the lodge at Hooghly was washed away in a storm surge, and a new settlement was set up at Chinsura, which was still officially called Hooghly. In the 1840s, a fort was built here. Hooghly was considered to be so important that it became the third port with a direct connection to the Netherlands after Batavia and Ceylon. The VOC considered cargo from Bengal very valuable, and for ships to sail from Bengal to Batavia and then to the Netherlands would mean that they would arrive there in the dangerous sailing season of autumn, which was not desirable. The VOC set up settlements in Patna, Chapra, Balesur, today's Baleshwar, Dhaka, and Kasim Bazar. Of these, Patna and Baleshwar had only a lodge and warehouses. Chapra had a large saltpeter factory built by the Dutch, and the saltpeter extracted here went straight to Europe. The settlement in Dhaka was very small. It was mainly established because it was the seat of the Nawabs of Bengal, and it was useful for getting permits and farmans from the Nawab. Kasim Bazar, which lay about 250 kilometers from Hooghly, was the center for silk production. By 1715, the VOC employed about 4,000 local silk winders there. On the northwestern coast, the VOC set up a flourishing trade network with a number of smaller establishments in the hinterland. Surat became the head of the directorate with a director at its helm and played an important role until 1759. Trading posts were set up at Cambay on the Gulf and at Burhanpur, Jabalpur, and Kursat in the interior. By the first half of the 18th century, there were problems for the Dutch at Surat as it gradually began to be cut off from the interior. And this caused a shortage in the supply of cotton and indigo from northern India. Trade on the Red Sea was severely hampered by pirates as well as extortion from the local rulers. Finally, after a lot of strife and almost impoverishment, the Dutch left Surat to the East India Company in 1759. Agra was an extremely important city for the European traders, not so much because it was the capital of the Mughal Empire, but for the fact that the best quality indigo came from the areas around it. The VOC set up a lodge outside Agra in 1621, about half a mile away from the river Yamuna. They also built a large building for bleaching and dyeing cotton next to the lodge. Besides indigo, the markets at Agra also offered the silks and cottons from Bengal. Since Agra was 6 weeks of travel away from Surat, inspectors of the VOC from Batavia very rarely deigned to visit it. This unfortunately allowed the VOC servants in Agra to make fortunes in private trade. And it was generally held that if someone did not return very rich from Agra, he had not been doing his job well. Another important trading city in the northwest was Ahmedabad. The markets here traded in indigo, cotton and silk fabrics, diamonds, and saltpeter. In Ahmedabad, you didn't pay import or export duties. Rather, you gave gifts to the local governor. The VOC established a settlement here in 1617. However, with the decline of the Mughal Empire in the early 18th century, trade declined and the roads between Ahmedabad and Surat became dangerous. So the VOC branch at Ahmedabad was shut down in 1744. Dutch Malabar had many settlements and lodges dotted along the coast. The settlements here were mostly taken by force from the Portuguese. Vengurla was the only one north of Goa. The others lay south of Goa. A lodge was built at Vengurla in 1637, mainly to keep an eye on the Portuguese. The VOC had also tried to take Goa from the Portuguese, but despite several attempts, had been unable to conquer it. The VOC initially only traded in pepper on the Malabar coast. They opened their first office in 1643 after signing a treaty with the local prince of Kanyakulam. After they had defeated the Portuguese and expelled them from Ceylon, they wanted to ensure that the Portuguese would not continue to threaten them on the Malabar coast. This became one of the main reasons for them settling there. However, the trade in pepper was another strong motivation. Quilon, or Koilon, was made into a chief settlement on the Malabar after it was captured from the Portuguese. This is the fortress at Koilon. This was followed by Craganore, which lay north of Cochin in 1662. And then Cochin, or modern-day Kochi itself, was besieged. Finally, after a 3-month siege, the Portuguese handed over Cochin in January 1663. The Portuguese fort of Cannanore, this is Fort Emmanuel, in Kochi, and here is Kannur, also called Fort Sant'Angelo. This was taken a month later, and in March 1663, the Dutch signed a treaty with the local Kolathiri chief, but ironically, the Portuguese and the Dutch had signed the Treaty of The Hague, ending hostilities in Europe by August 1661. But the news didn't reach this part of the town, the part of the world, until the Portuguese had actually been expelled from the Malabar coast. This is another image of Kannur. The Dutch governor of Ceylon wanted to establish a monopoly on the pepper trade on the Malabar, and the fort and harbor at Cochin were a very good center for shipbuilding and for ship repair. The Malabar was originally under the commandment of Ceylon, but it became a separate independent commandment in 1699. Cochin became its seat of government and new fortifications were built at Quilon, Kannur and Craganor. However, the VOC found it very difficult to get a monopoly on the pepper trade. The contracts with the local princes proved to be very difficult to enforce. Pepper was being smuggled out by the Arab merchants and sold to the English East India Company. And the rise of the powerful Travancore state south of Cochin around 1730 meant there was another player in the game. The VOC tried to prevent their entrance into the pepper trade by carrying out military action, but they lost the Battle of Colachel in 1741. The pepper trade was further threatened by the Kingdom of Mysore further north. After 1770, the VOC sold off the lesser profit-making settlements, including Craganor, to local princes. When a harbour was built in Travancore in 1781, the Asian pepper traders completely bypassed the VOC's settlements. Finally, the high government in Batavia decided that the profits were too low to keep the settlements on the Malabar, and only Cochin was still held. This too was handed over to the British English East India Company in 1795 on the basis of the famous Q letters. So what about Bombay? We often hear about the Dutch and Bombay. So in Bombay, the governor Humphrey Coke had wanted to add fortifications to the old manor house. However, this is in the mid 1600s. However, the East India Company's council in Surat were absolutely against the idea. They didn't want to spend any more money and pointed out that if the king had wanted to fortify the manor house, he would have sent money from England. But an outbreak of war with the Dutch in 1665 meant that Cook could actually start fortifying it. And we have our Bombay castle actually being fortified for the first time because of this. And these fortifications did manage to withstand an attack from the Dutch fleet in February 1673. Dr. John Fryer, in his work, has written that the Governor General of Dutch India, Rickloffer van Hoon, actually attacked Bombay, which was at that time under the Governor General Gerald Ainger. And he says that the Dutch found themselves facing quite a large amount of firepower in the form of 100 cannon on the fort and 80 pieces at other convenience stands. The Treaty of Westminster, which was signed in 1674 between England and Holland, finally relieved the English settlements of Bombay of any further apprehension from the Dutch. So the VOC can be called one of the most successful companies of all time. It raised enough capital in 1602 to create this globe-straddling multinational conglomerate employing 70,000 people at its peak. In its 200-year run, it sent over 1 million people to Asia. And according to Alex Paynes, who does research on the history of very large trading companies, the year 1637 was a boom for the VOC. Combined with the famous tulip mania, the worth of the VOC was estimated at 78 million Dutch guilders, which translates with inflation to 7.9 trillion in modern dollars. As the writer Peter Fisk puts it, if the market capitalization of 20 of the world's largest companies was added together, it comes up to 7.9 trillion. So what happened to the VOC? Such a large company, so much money. Unfortunately for the VOC, the 18th century wasn't so great, and in its last quarter, matters went from bad to worse. The very large organization had become very slow and lumberous. Profit margins also began to be reduced as the VOC began to trade in more and more products like tea and coffee and textiles in which competition was fierce. Intra-Asian trade also declined after 1760. The costs for the company kept increasing. In particular, more soldiers and more patrols were required because of the English presence. More local skirmishes and wars, particularly in Java, cost money. And private trade by company servants, though it had been prohibited, grew to such an extent that it was hurting the company financially. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War caused great damage to the Dutch economy and ultimately gave the VOC the final blow. The English fleet completely stopped Dutch shipping traffic between the Netherlands and Asia. As a result, no products came from Asia to the Netherlands and debts rose rapidly, and no money transports arrived in Asia to purchase goods. Moreover, everything remained in the warehouses there. So by the end of the 18th century, most of the Dutch colonies had been taken over by Britain because of politics in Europe. Another aspect of the East India Company on which a lot of research is being done recently is on the human cargo that was carried on VOC ships. And it is emerging that the Dutch transported thousands of men, women, and children from Bengal, the Coromandel, and the Malabar to work on plantations in Southeast Asia, Mauritius, and Réunion as indentured labor. A slave at Pulicat could be sold for anywhere between 4 to 40 guilders. The trade in slaves continued despite the ban by the British governor of Madras, and it was only in the late 18th century that the slave trade was phased out. But I must point out here that it's not only the Dutch that traded in slaves. Local pirates, the Portuguese, the French, and the English vessels would also do this. They would come they would land at the coast, go into the local countryside, imprison men and women, and then these captive slaves would be sold off at the other ports, and they were then sold as domestic servants. They were cooks, they were barbers, they were carriage drivers, they were entertainers, and there was apparently a huge demand for these coffres, the African slaves who were being brought in the towns of both Bombay and Calcutta. So what remains of the Dutch presence today? Just broken down forts and lodges. This is Vingurla, totally dilapidated in a terribly dangerous condition. Locals call it Dachanachi Vakar, in a really, really tragic state. At Kannur, Fort St. Angelo is in a slightly better state. We do have some walls and some ramparts left. Kraganor has pretty much nothing left. This is just a part of a wall. And sadly, even in the plaque over there, they do not mention the Dutch at all. They talk about it as built for the Portuguese, but don't mention the Dutch. In Kochi, Fort Emmanuel, a part of it, some ramparts and some walls are still around. The St. Francis's Church at Kochi was built by the Dutch. That is still there. And this is still around. This was considered to be the governor's palace. Today it is called Malabar House. It has been otherwise called Bolgatti Palace. It is now a luxury hotel. So it's just about the last surviving vestige there. Sadras has had a restoration by the ASI, and this is the cemetery at Sadras. Pulicat, the fort itself is gone, but you can see the outline in a satellite image. However, there is a cemetery at Pulicat. You can still see the Dutch cemetery at Pulicat. This is the Dutch cemetery, and there is an adjoining Dutch garden at Surat. The same at Chinsura. You have the Dutch cemetery left at Chinsura. And the old Dutch church at Hooghly still stands, though its tower has gone. And this is in Patna. Patna's collectorate office has one part that was actually built by the Dutch. This was, it's now a record room. However, very recently they have been talking about breaking it down. It's just the lockdown that has saved it. It will be gone soon enough. What does remain are these sweet things. So the very famous Naan Khatai of Surat are considered to be a legacy of the Dutch. It is a kind of Dutch shortbread, and the story goes that when the Dutch left Surat, their bakeries were handed over to local Parsis, and there was this dried bread, this leftover dried bread that they used to sell, which became very, very popular. And one of the bakeries owned by a Framji Pestanji Dotiwala became very famous for producing these Naan Khatai biscuits. You can now actually get them online. You can order them and they'll post them to your house. This is actually from that ad of theirs. And these are what we call toplina paneer. This is cottage cheese made in little baskets that allows the whey to flow away. And it's believed that the art of cheese making was taught to the Parsis by the Dutch in Surat. Kerala has its own. It's called the brooder. The brooder is this very yeasty, bready cake, which is flavored with nutmeg and sometimes has dried fruit in it. It's believed the term comes from the Dutch word brood or bread. This is also to be found in Sri Lanka, where they call it bloder, and it is made in a fluted tin. And in Malaysia, where it is called bluda, and there they do not use yeast, they use toddy, which probably was what was used originally to make this bread. And you can still get this bread in Cochin at 2 bakeries even today. So on that note, I end this talk. I hope you enjoyed this little look into the Dutch presence in India. I'll stop share, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. There is something in the chat, so I just want to say, thank you very much, Venkatesh. Thank you. Hi, yeah, Vishal has a question, and then Sonal. Yeah, go ahead, Vishal.
Ma'am, my question is basically when you were talking about the English and the Dutch acquisition of the ports along the Coromandel coast. So actually, Dutch massacre of the British at Ambiona, it had happened in 1623. So that compelled British to move towards the East India. So it was in 1623. At the same time, ma'am, there is, I think, chronological confusion. So that at the same time, there was the Dutch and British alliance against the Portuguese, and there was battle. It was fought against the Portuguese and Lisbon. So when that time when the 10 ships were mutually defended and safeguarded from the Dutch and the common alliance of the Dutch and basically English. And at the same time, ma'am, there was a kind of revolt took place in Ambiona at the same time in 1620. So this is a dichotomy. Can you explain?
Amboina is not in India, first and foremost. I hope you know that.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So
It's in
Amboina
Indonesia.
is in Indonesia. And I told you that the earlier part, the East India Company, the English East India Company, was not strong enough to face the Dutch VOC at that point of time. That's actually why the Amboina massacre took place, where the Dutch took over the British local factory and actually killed everybody over there. But I'm sorry, I did not understand the dichotomy part of it. Are you saying that I said that the British took it over, but you're saying that the Dutch?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. At the same time, in 1623, there was a Dutch, basically, in 1623, Dutch, because of the Dutch, the massacre had happened at Ambiona in Indonesia. So because of that, the supremacy, so British took over the supremacy in Ambiona in Indonesia. So because that compelled British to move towards the East Indies, and at the same time, there was a kind
but
of
already
alliance.
in the Amboina is in the East Indies.
Yes, ma'am. East Indian towards the India. I mean to say towards the India. Indian.
They were already.
Supported.
I don't think that compelled them to do that. They actually lost their place in the Indies, East Indies, and frankly never really went back to such a great thing until much later. And European events definitely had their sort of repercussions over here. But can I look this up and get back to you, because I'm a little confused at the moment. Okay, Vishal?
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Sure. Thanks. Sorry, Sonal.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Before the question, a big compliment. I've attended your Bombay Forts lecture with Institusen. So
thank you.
I was looking forward to the Dutch that I don't know, and it was an amazing lecture. My question to you is, as these 5 European cultures, Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, French, and British, were constantly in, kind of a tiff to acquire these sites along all the coast of Indian Peninsula, did the spaces that you mentioned specifically, I'm an architect, so my question is with that background, spaces that you mentioned like factories, warehouses, lodges, forts, and maybe settlements, just fortified settlements, and shipyards and dockyards, how they were functionally different, and were these typologies parallel with all five cultures?
They were not functionally different at all. In fact, almost every fort is built on a very European, what is called the Trace Italian style. So whether it's a French fort or a British fort or a Portuguese fort or a Danish fort or a Dutch fort, they look identical. And they were quite smart. Once they took over somebody's fort, they used it as is. They didn't bother to make it such that, you know, you can see their emblems on it very distinctly different. The emblems actually we see only in the cemeteries. We don't see them on the forts at all. So no, they didn't do that. The warehouses, the lodges, they're essentially defense structures. So even the warehouses, when we say a warehouse, it was not like a warehouse of modern times. It was a fort, you know, it had a large fortified wall outside and the goods were kept inside it. So no, there is absolutely nothing that you will find which we can say, this was French, this was British, this was Dutch, nothing. Architecturally, not at all different. They all use the Trace Italian style very, very effectively. And you saw this in the images. Because when the Portuguese had them, the Portuguese would build the Trace Italian style, the Dutch would come and take the same fort and they would continue using it because after all, it was there for protection. So unfortunately, even in the housing inside it, because they would have been made of wood mostly, we really don't have much left. There is nothing where you can say this is British versus French. They actually borrowed local styles. So you will find the houses were more the local, whether on the Coromandel or the Malabar or in Surat, the local wooden structures would have been used. So architecturally, no, I don't think there is any difference.
Okay, just a small extension to this one more. When you say that these lodges, like the Vengurlechi Vakhar, you know, if we look at it, Vakhar in Marathi means a godown or a thing. So
Yeah.
were these forts were military forts or just fortified godowns?
They were fortified godowns.
Okay.
So a military fort, you would have seen definitely a Trace Italian, very different. It would have had ramparts. It would have had large sloping walls. The warehouses or lodges, the lodge is the term for the warehouse. What the English East India Company called a factory, the French and the Dutch called a lodge. So they were essentially fortified godowns, to use that word.
A big thank you. Looking forward to have lectures separate on Portuguese, Danish, British, and French. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Sorry, Venkat has a couple of questions. Venkat, the Armenian church in Hooghly, I'm sorry, I do not know about this. I did not find it when I was doing my work on this. And the cemetery at Surat is actually, you know, shared. You get East India Company graves in it as well as some Dutch graves. But sorry, I have not personally been there either. Sorry, Venkatesh. So I can't respond to that one very effectively. Dipanjali, where these gold pagoda are kept? No, they're privately, if you know, either in private collections or in museum collections. There's nothing else. Gold being one of those things that, you know, if you found coins and you needed them, you either used it because it was its value of gold, or then if you had new rulers, they melted it down and issued their own coins. It's quite expensive to melt down and issue new coins. So frankly, people would continue using it because it wasn't about the image that was on it. It was the weight in gold. That was its value. I hope I answered that question. Sorry. Adil, I will have to check on this. The Ostend company, why Ostend as a separate company? I do not know. I would have to look that up because as per what I have read, it was part of the VOC and no separate company was there. But I will look it up. Sorry, any more questions? No, Sonal. No railways. The Dutch were gone by then. Yeah. They were only interested in getting goods for trade. So I take cotton from here, which I give to the people in the Moluccas in exchange for spices, which I can then take and sell in Europe. Or I take, you know, saltpeter straight away to Europe, which I can sell at big bucks for everybody wants saltpeter for gunpowder. So no, railways is much later. Anybody else? Any question? Anything? No? Then Dr. Modi, do we end now?
Yes.
So thank you
Yes,
very
yes.
much for all of you coming here and listening to me today. Thank you. Dr. Modi, you want to do the closing?
Yes,
Or
close, I will just close it.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I think something wrong with my video, but I really enjoyed the lecture very much. Right at the beginning, Rashna was telling me, tell me what you think of it after the lecture. I think it was fascinating and a tremendous amount of work has gone into the preparation. Congratulations, and the presentation was excellent. I think all of us enjoyed it. And we're happy to inform you that the next lecture or this program that Dr. Pocha will undertake for us will be a virtual tour of Freetown sometime in the next month, the next year. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank
thank
you,
you
Dr.
very
Pocha,
much.
for this very excellent presentation, and to all of you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.